When I think back to my childhood, some of my fondest memories are of the summers I spent at my grandmother's house. It was a modest, weathered place with a wraparound porch. Her home had a way of wrapping you in warmth. It was the safest place in the world to me. The memories of summers spent in her house had always been warm and safe, but there was one part of her house that didn't feel quite the same: the attic. I don't know why that day I agreed to help my grandmother clean out that room. The attic had a reputation for being the forbidden part of the home. We rarely went up there, and when we did, the air felt heavier, as if it were charged with unspoken secrets. That day, as we sifted through boxes of old clothes, photos, and dusty books, I stumbled upon an old trunk that had always been pushed into a corner. Opening it revealed faded toys and a small porcelain doll with a cracked face. It felt unsettling, almost as though it was watching me. I picked it up and felt a bizarre chill run down my spine. My grandmother paused as she saw the doll and quickly urged me to put it back. "Some things are better left alone," she said, her tone grave. My curiosity raised, I pressed her for details. After a moment of silence, she reluctantly told me about a little girl who used to live in the house decades ago. She had vanished one day without a trace, and the family was never the same afterward. Grandma continued to tell me that strange occurrences had haunted the household since. Whispers in the night, footsteps when no one was around. Later that night, I fell asleep in my old room, only to be awakened in the early hours by soft laughter drifting in from the attic. Confused and intrigued, I convinced myself it had to be my imagination. But as the nights progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the laughter echoing faintly in the dead of night. Finally, I decided to investigate. Gathering my courage, I tiptoed back upstairs to the attic with a flashlight. The room felt colder than before, yet eerily silent except for the sound of my own breathing. As I scanned the room, my heart raced, and I felt as though something was urging me to leave. Suddenly, I spotted the porcelain doll where I had left it, a little displaced but still familiar. Just then, that same laughter erupted, but this time it was sharper, tinged with sorrow instead of joy. Alarmed, I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of a fleeting shadow darting behind the boxes. It seemed ridiculously impossible, yet the weight of overwhelming sadness pressed against me. I managed to stumble back down and rushed to my grandmother, rattled and breathless. "I think I saw her," I said, panic creeping into my voice. Grandma's face paled, her eyes widened, and she shook her head, telling me to forget it, that some spirits seek companionship and never find peace. We locked the attic door and the doll remains there to this day, but the laughter continues in my dreams, haunting me with the broken promise of a childhood lost. My visits to Grandma's house turned from fond memories to something darker. Now I avoid the attic, yet still hear echoes of a little girl longing to play, a reminder of someone forever trapped in the shadows of the past. When I moved into my new apartment, the first thing I noticed was the cabinet. It was an old wooden piece with glass doors, standing in the corner of the living room. Inside were about a dozen dolls, all lined up like little soldiers, their painted faces staring blankly ahead. The landlord said it was left by the previous tenant. He claimed someone was coming to pick it up, but weeks went by and no one showed up. I didn't have the energy to move it myself, so it stayed where it was. At first, I didn't pay it much attention, but the longer I lived there, the more uncomfortable I felt around the dolls. It wasn't that I believed they were haunted or anything. It was just unsettling. Their eyes seemed to follow me, especially when I walked through the living room at night. Then little things started happening. I'd come home from work and find the cabinet doors slightly ajar. At first, I assumed I hadn't closed them properly, but after the third or fourth time, I made a point of latching them firmly before I left. One evening, I found one of the dolls outside the cabinet. It was a small one with a cracked porcelain face and faded blue ribbons in its hair. It was sitting on the floor a few feet from the cabinet, upright, like someone had placed it there. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I must have bumped the cabinet or that it had fallen somehow. I put the doll back and made sure the doors were latched, but the next morning it happened again. The same doll was sitting in the same spot on the floor. This time, I was sure I hadn't touched the cabinet. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows, wondering if someone was messing with me. Everything was secure and I lived alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I woke up to a faint noise, like a soft scraping sound. My heart was pounding as I crept into the living room. The cabinet doors were open, and it seemed like that doll had been turned to face the door, its lifeless eyes staring at me. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I called the landlord and told him I wanted the cabinet gone immediately. He promised to send someone to pick it up, but no one came. A few days later, I decided to handle it myself. I packed the dolls into a box, trying not to look at their faces, and carried the cabinet out to the curb. I left the box of dolls on top and didn't care if anyone wanted them. That night, I felt a huge sense of relief. The living room was empty, and the apartment felt lighter. But the next morning, I got a text from my neighbor. "Hey, did you leave some dolls outside last night? I saw someone poking around your trash around midnight. They took the box but left the cabinet." I didn't respond. I didn't want to know who had taken the dolls or why. I just wanted them gone. For a while, things seemed normal. I was sleeping better, and there were no more strange noises or feelings of being watched. But last week, when I was walking home late, I noticed something. In the window of a thrift store a few blocks from my apartment, there was a display of old dolls, and in the center of the display, sitting upright with its cracked porcelain face and faded blue ribbons, was the same doll that had been on my floor. It felt like it was waiting for me. I didn't go inside. I crossed the street and walked home as fast as I could. Every now and then, I think about that doll and wonder who bought it or where it might be now. Part of me hopes I never find out. I've always had a fascination with dolls. It started when I was a little girl, collecting porcelain dolls my grandmother gave me. Over the years, my collection grew, filling shelves in my bedroom. Each one was special to me, and I took pride in keeping them in pristine condition. But a few months ago, something changed. It started with the noises. Faint creaks in the middle of the night, like the sound of furniture settling. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house was old, and I assumed it was just the usual sounds of wood expanding and contracting. But after a few nights, the creaks became more distinct. They seemed to come from the corner of the room where the dolls were displayed. I told myself it was all in my head, but the uneasiness lingered. One night, the noise woke me up. It was a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. I turned on the light and stared at the shelf of dolls, my heart racing. Everything looked normal. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I checked the shelf, looking for anything out of place. All the dolls were exactly where they should be, sitting upright with their lifeless eyes staring into the room. I dusted the shelf and tightened a few screws, convincing myself that would solve the problem. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent. And every time they woke me, I felt like the dolls were off. Their positions seemed slightly different, though I couldn't prove it. After a week of restless nights, I decided to set up a camera. I placed it on my dresser, pointed directly at the shelf, and hit record before going to bed. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, my stomach tight with anxiety. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The dolls sat motionless on the shelf, bathed in the dim light of the room. But then, around 2:30 a.m., I saw it. One of the dolls, a small one with a painted pink bonnet, moved. It was subtle, just the slightest tilt of its head, almost imperceptible. I rewound the footage again and again, staring at the screen in disbelief. I told myself there had to be an explanation, maybe vibrations from a passing car or a shift in the floorboards. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For the next few nights, I kept the camera rolling, but nothing happened. The doll sat perfectly still, and I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe the first movement had been a fluke, but then I started seeing it with my own eyes. I'd glance at the shelf while brushing my hair or getting ready for bed, and I'd swear the doll in the pink bonnet was moving. Sometimes it looked like its head had shifted slightly, other times like its eyes were focused in a new direction. Last week, it happened again. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned to look at the shelf. The doll's arm was moving. It was barely perceptible, a slow, deliberate shift, like it was trying to reach for something. I sat frozen, too terrified to move, until the arm stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed the doll into a box and drove to a thrift store across town. I didn't care what they did with it, I just wanted it gone. When the clerk asked if I wanted a receipt, I shook my head and walked out without saying a word. Since then, I haven't heard any strange noises, and my room finally feels like my own again. The shelf is still there, lined with the rest of my collection, but sometimes I catch myself glancing at the empty spot where the doll used to sit. And every now and then, I think I hear that faint tapping sound in the middle of the night.